Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, while it's last call for Flybe and Flyr, the reopening of China and strong demand gives airlines much more hope for the summer ahead. But are airlines doing enough on staffing to ensure they can party like it's 2019? My name's Graham Dunn, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper. Hi Lewis.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Not bad at all, not bad at all. We our first sort of real podcast of the year, and it's quite an interesting time, almost quite a positive time for airlines, despite, I suppose, a sort of continued economic headwinds surrounding it.
Yeah, I think so far there doesn't seem to be much let up in the narrative we've discussed before, which is, the idea that despite those headwinds, a lot of airlines are still seeing bookings holding up really strongly in the first quarter. And we're sort of midway through the results season globally. We're about to start hearing, I think, some of the big European carriers soon. But certainly so far, the finances for the last quarter of the year were kind of in line with the narrative we heard in the third quarter, which is a strong performance. And while clearly, the seasonality means that the last quarter probably won't yield quite as impressive results at face value, it's still, as you say, the most of the messaging is things are looking good. But having said that, we have lost a couple of airlines in Europe over the past couple of weeks.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, as stories and, headlines wise, they make very big news. And obviously for the people involved, directly involved, both customers and particularly those working for the airline, that they're very big stories. But in fact, I guess in the broader picture, we lost Flybe, the UK regional airline, the kind of Flybe 2.0, I guess you'd call them, the initial version of which had collapsed before, just on the eve of the pandemic. In fact, the pandemic had sort of kind of tipped it over. It was the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the original Flybe operation. That carrier had resumed operations last year, but again, mounting challenges there brought it financial collapse and having to stop operations at the end of January. And for Flybe, I guess, on the one hand, I mean, it was always going to be difficult to resume operations during the COVID, but to some extent, it feels like the wider issues, particularly around securing aircraft, were probably one of the major problems and probably an unforeseen problem that Flybe had to contend with.
Yeah, there's certainly, obviously, economies of scale are really important with airlines, particularly startups, if they are hamstrung by the situation we have now, where it's actually, given where we were a year ago, surprising to be saying that it's tough to get that capacity. That's partly, obviously, because some airlines are holding on to older aircraft for longer because the deliveries of new aircraft are delayed. We've got issues with maintenance of existing aircraft, which is grounding some aircraft for longer than expected. Obviously, supply chain issues are within that, and we've got also issues with the loss of staff at key manufacturers, MRO providers, etc. That means these things are slower. So it's when you look at Flybe, obviously the administrators gave that as one of the reasons, I think, for the cessation of operations, was that the airline just hadn't been able to get the aircraft in to fulfill its schedules and reach that kind of point where it really starts bringing in the money. Of course, that's an untested theory, and I think going back to what you were talking about where Flybe had come from, it's relaunched into a market that the brand had left a couple of years earlier. Now, of course, we've had the pandemic in that time, so some carriers had picked up probably its most attractive routes in that intervening period. Obviously, as I say, with the caveat that the pandemic obviously had an impact on the amount of connectivity everywhere. So I think it kind of was on the back foot a bit to begin with, as most airline startups are. But you add in those factors, so the fact that it was coming into a market that it had left, so competitors had a chance to pick up some of its attractive routes. But also it was launching into a market last year that was still in the early stages of coming out of the Omicron variant of COVID-19. And the simple fact is that the UK domestic market, as Flybe's first kind of collapse showed, this not a market that's very easy at all.
No, absolutely. And ironically, the other airline that we lost a couple of days later, which was forced to cease operations, another startup, Norwegian startup, Flyr, they'd been operating for a little over a year or so, having again launched operations during the pandemic or since the pandemic. And again, probably there were signs that they were struggling. They were operating a dozen Boeing 737s, and they'd already parked up half of those over the winter period. There was a challenge there. They'd cut back their network in order to make the operation more sustainable. The airline market is a very seasonal market, for most airlines, especially any pointed towards leisure markets or holiday travel. They obviously make most of their money over the summer months. So Flyr was already up against it. It was working on a refinancing, and when that didn't come together, that they had to pull plug on their operations again. So you have two airlines collapsing within the space of a week in Europe. It makes, for a lot of headlines and a slightly disarming narrative. But let's, I guess, in the broader picture, they are relatively small operations, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So the impact capacity-wise is pretty small. I mean, Flybe had, I think, 9 -8s in its fleet, as we talked about. That lack of aircraft was perhaps one of the things really weighing on it. But and Flyr had 12 737s. In the latter case, the Norwegian market's an interesting one because when Flyr became an idea and when it was launched kind of back in 2021, having been announced in 2020, of course, Norwegian itself, the airline, was in a much different position. It had retrenched pre-COVID, then was kind of in a sort of hibernation mode as COVID happened. And, it looked like there was a hole in that market where, Europe's big low-cost carriers haven't necessarily made big strides. And that maybe is part of the reason it's a challenging market, because it's considered quite high cost with some of the airports and everything. But yeah, so at the time Flyr launched, there was a bit of a hole in that market for a low-cost carrier, arguably. But, then Norwegian came back quite strongly. And it is now, Norwegian's up towards its 70, 80 aircraft, whereas Flyr was on 12. And, Norway's not a huge country. I think the idea that it needed 2 low-cost carriers is probably debatable, given what we see across the rest of the region, really, where it's kind of the market's dominated by those big players or the, in some cases, the low-cost carriers at the big network groups. So sort of like Flybe, really. What's difficult to see from where they started to where they kind of finished, really, what was hard to see is what really function they were playing in those markets. So as you say, and looking at the competitive side of things, so on a route by route basis, in Flyr's case, that talking about Norwegian, SAS is a big player despite its challenges in Norway and obviously in that the region around Norway. But Flyr wasn't flying any particularly unique routes or anything. It was really up against those competitors. Flybe was seeking out what might be considered niche, domestic and regional routes. But again, they're up against huge players in some cases. And as an example, we know that Ryanair recently announced it was coming back into the UK domestic market. So they never really got going. So when you talk about the impact this is going to have, that they have dropped out, I don't think it's huge. I think it's a story as old as time in the airline industry, really, where startups fail because there simply isn't that need in the market, and there are much stronger players, lower costs, able to make it work, unfortunately.
And I think it's notable, and as I say, it was very difficult circumstances for those airlines and those people working at those airlines. But, generally speaking, remarkably few airlines, while they've retrenched, there have been very, very few airline failures and collapses. And especially if you compare it with the collapses of operators we saw after the financial crisis, and some time after that, particularly around this time of year, obviously a particularly challenging time for airlines, where you had some very big names go out of business. Actually, those large names, and partly because they many of them have seen financial support, which has kept them going during the crisis, pandemic related, not quite giving them a clean slate, but certainly giving them a breathing space. So you aren't seeing the same level of airline failures and collapses, which is, why I think Flybe and Flyr going within a few days of each other was very striking. But actually, the narrative for airlines generally, we talked about the results season that we've seen, and pretty much every airline executive you hear talking at the moment is, there's still caution in their words, but they are generally saying, trends, yields, bookings and demand remain strong. Everything they can see at the moment remains strong, albeit they're all aware things could change and there's different market conditions. And, adding to the sort of positive picture for airlines, the last market, which was out of reach for the network carriers, at least for international network carriers, China, is coming back online. And, it might be a slightly tentative step that carriers have made towards that, but we are starting to see airlines talking about return to that market, aren't we?
We are. That is, when we talked about what 2023 could bring that would make a big difference, obviously China reopening and was one of them, and it's happened. Well, I think we always suspected it would happen quite, overnight and quite suddenly, but maybe not quite as soon as it has. Sorry, but when you look at the global data for the airline industry in 2022, you really get a sense of how the global industry can get so far, but without China, the overall data is always going to be depressed because it is such a huge market, both domestically and international. As you say, the longer haul into China has always been a challenge for Western carriers, for example. I think they've struggled sometimes to make the secondary cities work, but there's still significant markets into the big hubs and some of the other less familiar cities. But clearly, regionally, it's a huge deal for lots of the carriers in countries around China that fly into that market, for the Chinese carriers themselves as well, and also the domestic market in China, which, it's not just China's reopened its borders, it's relaxing its zero COVID policy, which was weighing massively on the domestic travel, which, actually had some of its worst months of the pandemic towards the end of 2022 in terms of traffic. So it is a big deal, and it's another reason actually for quite a lot of optimism in the airline industry looking into the rest of 2023. I think at the same time, it depends what you read, but certainly there are some indications that some of the economic indicators that are of concern are looking slightly better than expected in some cases, not always, but certainly signs that maybe inflation might be easing slightly. Clearly, the war in Ukraine is still a huge factor for specific airlines and for certain markets. And that's, again, coming back to China. We all know that European carriers are at a disadvantage in flying into Asia and China because they can't overfly Russian airspace, whereas there's that curious dynamic where Chinese carriers theoretically can at the moment. So that'll be something to watch in terms of competitive landscape. But it's we're talking about the failures, but they are small, and compared with where we were a year ago, looking, when Omicron had kind of really got everyone down, really having been, a lot more optimism about the year ahead. It's looking okay. Of course, I'm probably tempting fate here, but let's see. But it is certainly, there are encouraging signs out there.
There certainly are encouraging signs for the summer. After the break, we'll have a look at whether airlines are doing enough and whether airports are doing enough to make sure they can make hay in the summer. If you're enjoying this podcast, why not sign up for our free weekly airline business briefing, delivered directly to your inbox every Thursday. You can register to get our weekly briefings together with any of Flight Global's other newsletters for free at flightglobal.com/newsletter. Welcome back, and before the break we were talking about the promising signs for the summer ahead for the airline industry, but there have been some interesting comments, particularly from United Airlines Chief Executive Scott Kirby, about how maybe that shouldn't be taken for granted, or at least airlines maybe need to do more to make sure they're ready to take advantage of that.
Yeah, obviously during the pandemic, there was a lot of talk of what's going to change coming out of COVID, and a lot of the predictions were wrong. A lot of them, still the jury's out. But in many cases, it feels like, it's not unreasonable to say a lot of the industry feels like it's coming back, not unrecognisable from what it was in 2019. But Scott Kirby is, as you say, come out, and he's turning into a really interesting chief executive to watch, and globally, really. He's got some really interesting thoughts on a number of issues. But he's basically come out and said that his competitors are in denial about, what he's calling a kind of significant structural change in the industry, and one of the biggest to happen for some time. And it basically it's not entirely new. We talked about Carsten Spohr's comments on the the kind of supply side constraints that he saw as a feature of the industry going forward. And Kirby is kind of focusing on that in some ways. So he's basically saying that his competitors in US haven't kind of cottoned on to the fact that you can't operate in the way that you could pre-COVID because of these, what he calls multiple constraints on the industry. One that's obviously had a high profile for some time in the US is the pilot shortage there. But he talks about a wider workforce constraint, and basically saying that airlines need to have a higher baseline staffing level to meet the same schedule that they would have done in 2019. That, again, maybe some factors that are unique to the US, or not unique, but certainly not relevant to all markets. But he says that state legislation has made it easier for workers to call in sick, and that comes amid, COVID is still spreading, and so there's already quite a high sickness level.
Just on that sickness point, it is quite interesting, isn't it? Because running an airline is a really, it's not something you can do from home, as a job. It's a really practical one. So, I think it's quite an interesting one around sickness as well, that probably culturally there's now more of an onus to work from home, or, steer clear of people if maybe you've got a cold or, any possible symptoms. But that element is even more pronounced for airlines in terms of COVID, if you're trying to keep that in check, just because it is such a hands-on sector.
Exactly, yeah, and it's both. Yeah, exactly. You're dealing with passengers, so if you're walking around and obviously have a cough or nose is running, whatever, it's not a good look. It wasn't a good look pre-COVID, and clearly it's not something you want necessarily to be happening.
You can't run an airline from a Teams call or a Zoom call, can you?
Exactly, and as you say, for some, like us included, I guess it's sometimes easy to forget that. And in the same way, you don't want someone to come in and give COVID to an entire crew, who then the knock-on effect is obviously very significant. So yeah, it's a big deal, and I guess he believes it's as combined with those laws on sick leave, means that it needs to be more fundamental in airline thinking going forward. And within that, of course, we've also had a lot of people leave the industry. So the workforce that is there now, and again, we're hearing a lot about whether it's airlines or the wider sector is staffing up much more strongly now, hoping to overcome some of the challenges we've seen before. But still, that means a lot of staff are not necessarily up to speed or as experienced as those that came before. And I think, as you've heard, that's not, as I said, that's not just airlines, is it?
No, absolutely. I was at a UK airports event in the last few days, which John Holland-Kaye, the chief executive of Heathrow Airport, who is in fact, it's been announced is going to be standing down later this year. And Heathrow obviously came under the microscope, and it has, from a pure numbers perspective, I think they would say they're well prepared for this summer ahead. They've crossed the companies at the airport there. They've recruited something like 20,000 staff over the last sort of 15 months or so, since the lowest points of the crisis, and they're only 5,000 short of the pre-pandemic levels, which I think plan to get to in the coming months. But what he did acknowledge was that it is difficult. You're trying to replace people who have worked, who were working, had 20, 25, 30 years experience, and you can't change that overnight. And that is an issue being replicated, across industries. Just getting that level of experience, will take time to come back. And, I think that's another factor, another reason Kirby's comments are interesting, in terms of airlines have to factor in a bit more in terms of staff levels, because you have lost experience. Not exclusive to this. All sorts of industries have lost experience, and the aviation sector is a pretty cutthroat one. The airline one is a pretty cutthroat one, and it's going to take. I'm not sure the world is quite ready to pay staff more to be able to bring them back in to sort of fast track through. There are lots of other attractive. And certainly in aviation, we've seen Ground handling in particular has been a very hard hit segment. That's a pretty physical and sometimes difficult hours job. And, maybe that during the crisis, people found other ways, less arduous ways of earning money. So, it is going to take a long time to both bring that workforce back and also to replace the staffing levels, the staffing experience that accrued during that. So what I thought was really interesting from Kirby, and United he is pitching himself as both himself and United as a sort of very proactive, dynamic airline. United, in fairness, had a fair bit of ground to make up probably on its rivals. They followed a very conservative course over the past 10 years or so. And so Kirby does position himself as a kind of a proactive thinker on this, and someone who's trying to challenge what they did before. And United, in capacity terms, and pretty much every activity is really active. But I think it is interesting because we haven't heard that many airline executives talking about what they're going to do above and beyond what they were pre-COVID.
Yeah, I think this is what really stands out. Exactly. Yeah, as I said before, we're back to the routine of decent summer profits last year, and then not quite as good in the winter and all this. But yeah, there aren't many people kind of putting their head above the parapet. Is that the phrase? And
I think it is.
Yeah, hopefully we can edit that out. And then and actually, talking about how things have changed, and it's quite brave to do that, clearly, because particularly if you're saying all your rivals are wrong, because you could look a bit silly in a few months. But certainly when he talks about the real world impacts of these things, we kind of seen them to an extent. So there have been some operational meltdowns in the US market in recent weeks, and Kirby's view is they are exacerbated by not having that inbuilt extra level of staffing and losing that experience. So yeah, that's interesting. And beyond that, of course, he and again, this is something Explorer's talked about. Manufacturers are struggling to meet delivery targets on aircraft, on engines, and on parts. So that is having a when you talk about whether the airline industry can keep growing at the rate it has been, Kirby's view is that is another constraint on that. But he also talks about technology as well. We saw the meltdown in ATC in the US in recent weeks. And he talks about, the technology and the infrastructure just cannot be relied upon, and it hasn't been invested in when it should have been over recent years. Again, when the industry was having a great run of profits towards the end of the last decade, maybe that's the kind of time we'd expect these things to be done, but they clearly weren't. So he again believes that technology is a constraint on growth. Of course, he will say that United saw this coming and has been doing everything that the rivals haven't. So they have been investing in that technology. Kirby reckons they need 10% more pilots and 5% more aircraft to match the same level of pre-pandemic capacity in the schedule. So it's really interesting, and as I say, something we'll see play out over the coming months. He's not alone in this view. The way he has presented it is clearly slightly different to what we've heard before. But also, I think Wizz Air, Joseph Ferrari, there, and that's obviously in a low-cost market in a different region, talked about that resilience as being really important and a kind of really, again, a fundamental change.
Yeah, absolutely. Wizz Air was a little scarred. It was among the more challenged of carriers in terms of some of the operational delays last summer in Europe. Wizz had been expanding very rapidly. It was forced to scale that back a little bit. It's still expanding, but not quite at the same pace it had originally planned. And that was it recognised it needed to put more resilience into the model. And for a low cost carrier, one that is, Wizz is probably one of the closest and truest observers to the old school classic no frills model, and in particular aircraft turnaround and efficiency rates is obviously absolutely central to that, and the utilization of them. And if you're going to operate new aircraft, which operate more efficiently and so forth, but you've got to pay for the new aircraft coming in, you need to run them at a high utilization rate, and you have to be able to do that. Now that Wizz's results is very clear about its ambition to get its utilization rates, its punctuality rates, its load factors back to pre-pandemic levels this summer. And, you have to ensure there's enough robustness and reliability in the system so that, there are going to be delays, and there are lots of things that could upset stuff. Even if airports have got staffing levels back, even if ground handlers are back to kind of levels which can handle the likely travel demand this summer, you have all the things that were a struggle in the system beforehand, whether that be air traffic delays, something certainly in Europe they are aware of and braced of, and Eurocontrol have already flagged the issue that they have, that as traffic demand comes back, if you got to 100% traffic demand today in Europe, they'd be having to manage that with, maybe 80%, 90% of the airspace, because Russia isn't open. So, straight away you have those kinds of challenges. And that's even before you get to potential labour impact of industrial action and stoppages, which, given where inflation is and given the various industrial relations across many countries at the moment, I think we would probably be anticipating challenges ahead on that.
Yeah, that's why I think it's still early in the year. But if we're looking at what themes are going to be the most interesting ones, I think for airlines, I do think your resilience. If we're looking at words beginning with R, I guess 2022 was really recovery, and it feels like we're moving into an era now where it's all going to be about resilience. Because I think if we're heading into the Northern Hemisphere summer and we quickly start getting stories again about whether it's the airport, whether it's the airlines themselves, ground handlers, whatever, are struggling in some markets, and Kirby turns out to be right that the industry hasn't cottoned on to this properly, certainly in some markets, then the industry is going to have to brace itself for some pretty bad press and pretty upset customers. Because I think while there would have been a degree of sympathy for the industry last year, coming out of essentially shutting down for 18 months, whatever, and then going back up to 60-70% capacity almost in the space of a few weeks, there is a degree where I think people had a bit of goodwill towards the industry. But if it doesn't show that resilience this year, and that doesn't just mean that's forgetting the kind of big events like the FAA challenges we've seen in the US, weather-related challenges, and things like that. It's going to be a long year, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It was summed up actually with the head of Edinburgh Airport, Gordon Dewar, I thought summed up quite well. He was also really, we just need a really boring summer. Airports need. And he wasn't talking about Edinburgh specifically there, but just airports in general and air transport after the last summer, after everything that has happened, just need a year of predictability. That's really what everyone would be in the air transport, airlines and airports alike would be hoping for this summer. We shall wait and see.
Well, maybe not journalists. I don't know.
No, we don't want it to be boring. There's nothing to write about then.
But not boring. It's happy if it's positive, but we could do without a period of negative developments, definitely.
Yes. We'll take positive. We just don't want boring. Lewis, we'll leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Cheers, Graham.
So that's all we've got time for. You can find links to the stories we have referenced in the podcast notes, and you can keep up to date with all the latest stories from across the industry at flightglobal.com. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you again next time.